So we're going to remember those women tonight for all the work that they've done in terms of uh, impact in Sioux City. And Sioux City in the early 1900s, this is a wonderful image of Sioux City from 1908. And Sioux City was experiencing tremendous growth in industry, population, and social and political movements that were rocking the nation at that time as well. The big industries in Sioux City at that time were the railroad industry, the wholesaling industry, and the stockyards. And Sioux City experienced a bust in the early 1890s, where we had a great deal of bankruptcy and debt built up. That debt was really reorganized in some sense as a community, and a very strong productive growth came out of that period. So if we look at the statistics from that time, just almost more than a doubling in size in 20 years, from 1900, 33,000 to 1920, over 70,000 people living in Sioux City, essentially the size that Sioux City is today. We were the second largest city in the state. We were absolutely one of the biggest industrial centers in the state, in the Midwest. And 20% of our population during this period was immigrants. So 20% of our population were people who were not born in the United States. When we look at the big industries at that time, the big three were the big meatpacking plants. And one of those was Armour and Company. Swift and Cudahy were the others. This was when the stockyards expanded and boomed into what became known as the mini city, because of the many thousands of people who worked there and came there every single day. The railroad industry. So this was just one of a few roundhouses in Sioux City. There were multiple railroad lines coming in and out of Sioux City, and they employed thousands of people. And so just this huge industry that is now really not what it used to be, certainly. American popcorn had its start during this time period in Leeds. Johnson Biscuit Company is another that you might have heard about that had its kind of roots from this time period, but there were many, many other major industries. Think about the auto industry and how from that period, from 1900 through 1920, it just completely remade the country, and certainly Sioux City as well. So there was a growth of all kinds of small businesses to very large businesses. So Ryle Miller Chevrolet, located just north of the museum, that's where this building is still located today, eventually grew into Knepfler Chevrolet. The Motor Mart right next to it, this was a building that was focused on the automobile industry. It was a place where you could buy and sell automobiles. It was basically a showroom. And that's, of course, the known as the Commerce Building today. But if you walk by and you look at the Commerce Building, up along the top, it'll say Motor Mart. So other prominent buildings were built at that same time. The City Auditorium across from the Woodbury County Courthouse was built in 1909. So we see a grand rebirth for this building with the Lamb Theater potentially going into this building in the next few years. The Sioux City Public Library built it at 6th and Jackson, now an apartment complex. And the Woodbury County Courthouse that was built in 1918. Now, this really does signify Sioux City's, I think, prominence and its willingness to be somewhat radical. So when the Woodbury County Courthouse was built in 1918, when it opened, people were not sure that we were ready for such a radical new design. And it has become one of the most acclaimed prairie style buildings in the country. And the prairie style is definitely a Midwestern style. So, but at the time it was very much radical. When we think of the social movements happening in the early 1900s, well, of course, this is a major one, the suffrage movement. And in 1916, Iowa had the chance to take their vote and have their say in whether women should be allowed to vote. Of course, only the men got to vote, but this is the point. They were having this vote. It fails in Iowa. On this image, you'll see Carrie Chapman Kat. She was the founder of the League of Women Voters, and she was from Iowa. She was the leader of the national suffrage movement. When it failed in Iowa was really a chance for that movement to be reborn. And she developed what was called the winning plan. And that was a plan to tick off state by state and to focus on the national movement and to try to get Congress and the president to support suffrage. That winning plan really was successful. I'll just mention this, in 1916, the 19th Amendment failed in Woodbury County. And that's because Woodbury County was essentially a wet county. And I'll talk about what that means in just a minute. This figure here, Wallace Short, he was the most prominent political figure in Sioux City in this time period, and he was interesting and very controversial. So he came to Sioux City in 1910, and he was invited to be the pastor at the First Congregational Church. And very soon he was disinvited to be the pastor of the First Congregational Church because of his controversial opinions. As a pastor, he was a wet, meaning he was in favor of allowing alcohol. He was against prohibition. Most Protestant pastors were in support of prohibition. He became a newspaper editor, and he was very involved in the labor movement, which was experiencing a lot of controversy in Sioux City at that time. There was a group of kind of a radical labor group known as the Wobblies, and he was a supporter of the Wobblies, and they met here in Sioux City. And in spite of all the controversy, he was elected mayor, and he served 3 terms as mayor. He was the newspapers and the newspapers and the business leaders tried to get him recalled, and he passed the recall. They tried to get him impeached, and he passed with 60% positive vote in his favor. So a very interesting character and sort of emblematic of Sioux City at the time. So again, we talk about that wet versus dry issue. Well, these guys were wet. They were definitely in support of alcohol, as was most of Woodbury County and Sioux City. And that was really because of the immigrants and the settlers who were living here. Alcohol was just a part of their lives. And at this time in Iowa, by 1916, Iowa has banned alcohol statewide. So previously it was kind of done county by county. And once it's banned in statewide, then Sioux City is really, they have to deal with that, I suppose, by going underground to some degree. And among the other things happening during this 1910 to 1920 period, we have a world war. And so the U.S. enters World War I in 1917. And here's, of course, Central High School with all the activity with the recruits basically learning semaphore so you could send messages via flag and radio instruction. The Spanish flu. Yes, we're familiar with this as we've learned about it over the past year, but I chose this image to talk about the flu because these young women were leaving Sioux City. They were nursing school graduates, and they were going to Camp Dodge to try to fight the Spanish flu. That experience of World War I and the Spanish flu very much became tied together. These were things that were happening concurrently and affecting one another. And in Sioux City, approximately 40 400 people died from the Spanish flu. And that was more Sioux Cityans than died in World War I. It was also most of those soldiers who did die in World War I from Sioux City died from the Spanish flu. So it just, those two came hand in hand, and we met them hand in hand. So I chose this slide to talk about that, the immigrant experience in Sioux City. There were immigrants from particularly Greeks, Syrians, Lithuanians, Poles, Scandinavians, Russians, African Americans, Jewish communities from several of these countries. This is a Polish honor guard that was affiliated with a Polish Catholic church, but there were many churches that were affiliated with these immigrant groups. But many of these folks resided in the South Bottoms, and I think we'll probably learn a little bit more about some of their impact in Sioux City and how organizations were involved in assisting them. The African American community was growing in Sioux City, particularly in the late 19-teens. So they're coming in search of better jobs, and particularly in search of relief from Jim Crow and the violence that was a big part of the South. And this is part of the whole larger American story known as the Great Migration. This is one of the greatest migrations in world history, but the greatest migration in Sioux City history. We're actually going to be learning more about this Great Migration in the next few months with some upcoming programs. So keep that in mind if you're interested in more museum programming. But this is Oscar Michaud. He lived in Sioux City in the late 19-teens along the West 7th Street area. He became much more well-known later, but he was a author, he was a homesteader, and he was a novelist, and he became the United States' first African-American filmmaker. Amidst all this, Sioux City has its first and only Sioux Cityan to become governor. So William Harding became governor in one term, 1917 to 1921. The big issues of the day, we've talked about prohibition, suffrage, and good roads, which we won't get into, but it was very important at the time. These were the key issues. Harding was wet, so he was in favor of allowing alcohol, and he won 70% of the vote in Iowa. He did something then that became very controversial. He initiated a language proclamation, which outlawed the use of foreign languages in public, in churches, in schools, or even over the telephone. So think about all those immigrants in Sioux City, all the places you would go where you might not be speaking English, your church, on the telephone, talking to someone, and he made it illegal. And this was during World War I. So this was really about American, kind of promoting American and outlawing the languages in particular of the people we were fighting against. But it was a very controversial issue. So let's talk a little bit about some of the organizations that came out of this period. This is an image from the Florence Crittenden home. This image is from the 1940s, but they started in 1907. Other organizations with roots from this area, the Wall Street Mission was started in 1890, and it joined with Goodwill in 1923. Shesler Hall was founded in 1901. The Booker T. Washington Center was founded in 1933. These images are both from those very early days. The Booker T. Washington Center eventually became the Sanford Center, and the Sioux City chapter of the NAACP started in 1937. Now, briefly, before I hand it over to our panelists, I want to share with you a few images from the organizations they represent. This is the Community House in approximately 1940. It started in 1921. And then I've got some other images from the interior, from some of the activities of the Community House. This is clearly some kind of tutoring or class going on. This is also from the 1940s. And then this looks to be, well, it must be a Christmas party. I mean, you don't have Santa unless you're having a Christmas party, but packed room filled with presents and excitement. Karen has sent me some wonderful pictures from the early days of the Junior League of Sioux City. And so here we see an image where the Junior League of Sioux City is doing one of their issues was a well baby clinic. So what you can see babies, you can see a poster about breast milk. So this is digging into some of those movements that we're talking about during this progressive era, this well baby focus. There's another well baby clinic, and this one is actually at the community house. So thank you, Karen, for finding that image. And then this is another image from the Junior League archives at the community house. Beautiful picture. And two more images of Junior League members, Glee Club, and then this is promoting some carnival or an activity. We're going to hear more about the Junior League in just a minute. And then these are some images from the League of Women Voters, their founder, Mrs. Oscar Ruff, and a list of some of their early officers. Definitely there's so much crossover in the names of the founders of all three of these organizations. I noticed that as I was searching through, and then you can kind of see we're getting a hint of some of the activities that the League of Women Voters were absolutely involved with. All right, so folks, you've had enough of maybe images. Let's get into the discussion. And I'm gonna share, you should see on your screen our three panelists and myself, and we'll talk about these three organizations. So I'm gonna just reintroduce, first we're going to be hearing from Carolyn Goodwin of the League of Women Voters of Sioux City. So Carolyn, are you all ready to tell us a little bit about the League of Women Voters of Sioux City?
I'm always ready to talk. I'll try and keep it to 10 minutes per the recommendation. So I've written down the time. And I might note for a little bit, Theresa, you would break up during your talk. So if that happens, enjoy that you don't have to listen to me for a little bit. And I do want to thank Theresa and the museum. I was struck that the actual public museum name, I think, began with 1960, but Theresa has set me straight that actually began much earlier as the museum. And I'm so grateful as a history teacher of yore. I value having local history, and it has been most helpful for me to have that and to have the program tonight focusing on women and our History Month, as well as International Women's Day. I am particularly going to talk a little bit, and I'm sorry for being personalizing this, but since League of Women Voters has been a key role for me, I want to share a little bit about my historical awakening and my path to the League of Women Voters, which was after 1920, thankfully. But my first awakening to politics, to the reality of the world, was as a high school senior in New Braunfels, Texas, sitting in my civics class, and we were in a brand new school building, 1963 to 64. Suddenly our intercom, and we didn't even know what that was until suddenly it came on, and we had the radio telling us that in Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy had been shot and we stayed in that class. We did not move classes or anything. We listened to that radio and the reality that President Kennedy was dead and the fear that went on. So that sparked my love of history, which was already there to a degree. I will share that I went to Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and in 1967 and 68, the second and third women's symposiums for social and political leadership were held. I didn't get invited to the first one, but I got invited to the second and the third. And that's where my interest in the League of Women Voters was birthed, because the women who did the best job of presenting were members of the League of Women Voters of Dallas, and our Dean of Women, who formed this whole event, was a member of the League of Women Voters of Dallas. I promised myself at that time that I was going to join the League of Women Voters someday, because I thought those are the sharpest, most knowledgeable people I'd ever heard among women. So I held to that promise. In 1981, we moved to Sioux City. And about 1983 or 1984, the memory gets a little foggy, and our records too, I was able to join the League of Women Voters. And I'm ashamed to tell you that as a person who taught American history from 1968 to 1971 in Dallas, well, actually in Richardson, Texas, that I had never heard of a woman I saw in the national magazine, the back cover, Carrie Chapman Kat, who Theresa has mentioned, founded the League of Women Voters. I had never heard of her. Pretty much what we got in history books, and I'll credit Texas for control of history and so on, was the fact that Susan B. Anthony was the leading suffragette, that 1848 there had been the Seneca Falls Convention, and women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. That was pretty much what women's history was for my day. I'm glad to say that thanks to the museum, I was able to get information about Carrie Chapman Kat and her history. A publication, the Sioux City Historical Journal, published in 1983, was gifted to me, and it had Kitty Green, professor at Morningside College's master's thesis, which was on the 1916 referendum for the woman vote, as they called it then. Actually, Carrie Chapman Kat was here during 1916 speaking in favor of suffrage. She had been here in 1989 to form the Political Equality Club. So she knew the area. She brought that sense of Iowa history. She actually had been raised in Webster City. She was actually born in Wisconsin, but her family came to Webster City and about when she was 7 years old. She became an educator. Actually, she went to Iowa State Agricultural College, Iowa State University today. She became a teacher, a principal, and superintendent of schools in Mason City, Iowa. So somehow there's a real bond for me to Carrie Chapman Kat. But I'll also say she was a wonderful politician. She took over from Susan B. Anthony for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, referred to as NAWSA. And she was president from 1900 to 1904. And then again, as Theresa noted, 1915, she lost the suffrage vote in Iowa, and the winning plan went into place to try and really work for a national amendment and to have that succeed. She plotted how that would go, and in 1919, she was able to work with a lot of other women's groups, Alice Paul being another woman leader, to get the Senate and the House to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. But you had to then have, by constitutional law, 3/4, or the method chosen, 3/4 of the state legislatures had to approve the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Iowa was the 10th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. We needed 36 because we were 48 states at that point in time. The key 36th state, and there's a wonderful story about a mother writing to her son saying he better vote for suffrage in Tennessee. He did, and Tennessee became the 36th state, with that one vote making the difference from a tie to actually a winning vote. And August 26, 1920, the amendment was written into law by the Attorney General of the United States. Carrie Chapman Kat in 1920, even before all the ratification was done, on Valentine's Day at the National American Women's Suffrage Association convention, she announced that NASA would become the League of Women Voters. She was positive we would get that vote, but they sweated it down to Tennessee, literally on a hot August day in Tennessee. But she formed the League of Women Voters as a nonpartisan organization that would not support political candidates or political parties as an organization, that it would truly educate women to vote, and made a very special point to do that by what she had done with the suffrage NASA members, and that was to have citizen academies. And Theresa had the lovely flyer, and I thank Theresa for the resources that she shared with me, because I knew nothing about when our local league was formed. And thanks to Theresa, I now have that information. The wonderful formation of the local league was that there were 10. I was really one of the first states to become a League of Women Voters of a state, and then to have local leagues. There were 10 local leagues, and they generally went by county names. But Sioux City was the Woodbury County Sioux City League of Women Voters, and then at other times it was called Sioux City Woodbury County, Sioux City-Woodbury County League of Women Voters. And as Theresa showed the picture of Mrs. Oscar Ruff as the first president, again, that nomenclature being credit to the man, was our vice presidents were Mrs. E.J. Stassen and Mrs. H. Cohn, not names I recognize from what my Sioux City history knowledge. Secretary was Miss Nan Jonas, and treasurer was Mrs. E. Moog. And I think that may be a familiar name in Sioux City history. The focus was on citizenship curriculum. They held meetings, and in 1920, one was led by a state League of Women Voters representative, Mrs. Max Mayer, who came to speak. And it was very interesting to see in programs that Theresa shared with me, the number of cooperating organizations, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, AAUW, Junior League, Sioux City Business and Professional Women's Clubs, Federated Clubs of Woodbury County, DH Chapter of PEO, Sioux City Teachers Club, Mount Sinai Sisterhood, all were cooperating groups who I suspect brought women in, got the word out, much as we do even today. And the programs really focused on preparation for voter education, voter registration, learn about political parties, about the election process, voting law, primaries, general elections, the difference in the two, and also about the election of state boards and commissions, as well as municipal and county governments. So it was really education, and little has changed since that time. We continue to do much of that as the League of Women Voters of Sioux City today. I think my time is just about up, so I'll pass on. I have more, but I'll share some of that in our discussion time. Thanks, Theresa.
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn. That sounds great. We'll look forward to hearing more. We're going to move on next to Karen Clark of the Junior League of Sioux City. So Karen?
Thanks, Theresa. So the seeds of our organization, the Junior League of Sioux City, were actually sown many miles away from Sioux City, actually in New York City. And that's thanks to Mary Harriman, who was the daughter of a very wealthy railroad magnate. You may have heard of E.H. Harriman of the Union Pacific Railroad. That was her father, her brother, Averil Harriman, would go on to become the governor of New York State. Clearly, this was an affluent background that she came from. And while I am certain that she could have chosen the genteel life of a young socialite, this 19-year-old debutante instead rolled up her sleeves and volunteered to help with New York City settlement houses. And then she gathered other like-minded young women, also probably debutantes and affluent young women, and they got together and worked in those settlement houses and then founded what became the first junior league in 1901, the Junior League of New York City. Now, what happened after that, you look at it in retrospect, is just, it's amazing. The idea of this young women's volunteer organization caught fire, spread rapidly, and not just across cities and states, but national borders too, when the Junior League of Montreal was founded, well before our league was founded. Today, our Junior League of Sioux City is one of nearly 300 leagues that stretch across 4 countries. And these are all organizations of women, all women with a mission. And we're all driven, I think, to make our communities a better place, whether that would be in Great Britain or whether it's in Mexico or it's in Canada, the United States, or here in Sioux City. Our league is actually one of the older leagues. And I know that this is something I'm going to want to touch on later on. We are the 39th league to enter the association. And this is really quite remarkable. So we start talking about the founding and some of the impact that women have. I think this is a really important point. Now, to talk a little bit about those 10 women that you saw that founded our league, these women were already very actively involved in the community. They were volunteering like crazy, and they were young women. What they felt they were lacking was structure. And what they, well, I guess let's pull from what they had to say themselves. They were asked to do volunteer service for so many organizations, all of them really worthwhile, that they found they could not do really good, well-organized work for any one of them. And they wanted to see that they were really accomplishing something. The need for a definite organization was strongly felt. Why not form a junior league for Sioux City was suggested. They were flourishing already in some 33 cities and accomplishing some real work. And so these 10 women applied for their charter with the newly formed Association of Junior Leagues. On April 11th of 1921, they held their first meeting. And I want you to know we still have the original minutes books.
Wow.
And we can read from those exactly. But their first meeting was held at the home of Dorothy Eaton Palmer, Mrs. Edward Palmer, in what we know now as the Chocolate Mansion. And these 10 women, the first thing they did was establish order, right? So they elected their officers, they established a due system, and then the next thing they did was they established a fine system so that if you had an unexcused absence, it was 50 cents and 25 cents for tardiness. And I'll tell you what, having seen their pictures, these are formidable looking women. There's no way I'd want to be late to one of their meetings, I tell you. I'd say this too, these women had a very clear mission. They didn't call it a mission statement in those days. It was titled The Objects of the League. But listen to this. The objects of the leagues are to foster among the members an interest in the social, economic, and educational conditions in Sioux City, to provide, as far as possible, volunteer workers in charitable movements, to raise funds for the maintenance and furtherance of work in which the league may be interested, and to train those who join the league along lines of efficient service and broad-minded citizenship. Well, you know, there's a lot of words in there, but it isn't terribly different than our actual mission statement today, which is to address community needs through the participation of trained volunteers. So a lot has changed in those 100 years, but in many ways it has not. Now, what impressed me most when I looked at this was the heading that was on there. You noticed it said Social Service Club to Expand. So already this group of 10 is planning on growth. And in fact, they did. They went from go to grow so quickly. This is 1921, and by the 1925-26 league year, they had grown from 10 members to 60. And these were vital women that were very busy. They were everywhere in the community. You've already seen pictures from the community house. They were, well, just to give you a little sampling, I pulled out what they did. If they started in April of 1921, by Christmas of 1922, they had already had a extremely successful first fundraiser, raising over $1,000, which is huge money for 1921-22. And they announced, and this was in the local paper, plans for holding a Christmas tree party at the community house on Saturday evening. Approximately 306 children will be entertained and given presents. Santa Claus, of course, will be there, and preparations are part of an extensive program in which League members are promoting. They expect that this event will be one of the largest and most elaborate of its kind ever held in the city. In other words, they wanted these children at the community house to have a grand Christmas, but they didn't stop there. To go on, under the direction of the League, 8 different charitable organizations in the city were going to be supplied with useful gifts, quote, included in the list of donations: an office desk for the Boys and Girls Home, $50 in cash for the YMCA, 2 playroom fables for the community house, a complete set of bedroom furnishings for the Crittenden Home, clothing for 50 girls at the Good Shepherd Home, a Victrola for St. Monica's Home, and that was the orphanage. I even found the picture of the little Victrola that they gave for the babies so that the babies could have music. Going on, a set of silver tableware for St. Anthony's Home, and lastly, funds with which to do redecorating and remodeling at the day nursery, which we now know as Mary Elizabeth Child Care and Preschool. So when I say they were everywhere, that's only part of it. They were also fundraising. And just because these weren't working women per se, as we know them now, a number of professional women in the early part of League was not what it is today, where most of our members do work outside the home. Just because they weren't employed didn't mean they didn't know how to make money, because they did. From their first successful cabaret dinner dance that I mentioned, they were off and running. But I got to tell you one fun story. It's my absolute favorite fundraising story of all time. So they announced in the fall of, would have been 1925, Ways and Means has said, all right, we're going to do something different. No social event, no ball, no gala, we're going to do something completely different. So each member was given a $1 bill and with a clever poem that went along with it. And they were to come back on February 1st. There will be a meeting, and you are to take this $1 investment and turn it into $25. And you can do it however you want. The things they came up with, oh my God, these were hilarious. So I gotta tell you some of this. When they came back on February 1st, they had their meeting in the evening, this time, once again, how about that? It was at the Chocolate Mansion at the home of Mrs. Palmer. And they announced each one had to describe how she had raised her $25 or more. And they gave awards. I would love to have been a mouse in the corner to have heard the stories about how a neighbor came next door to borrow a shirt because he didn't have a clean one. And one of the members said, absolutely not. You're going to rent it from my husband and you're giving me $1. Now it goes on from there. They gave 2 big awards. One of them was for having raised the most money, and that was Mrs. Howard V. Martin. She raised $108, and she not only did a rummage sale, sold some Christmas trees, but she packed lunches. You know, you'd mentioned the stockyards and all the people that were employed there, Theresa, in those early years. So during the course of those 3 months, she made lunch boxes prepared with sandwiches, cake, pickles, and which with coffee, she took to the employees and sold them at the stock exchange and other offices in the stockyards. She made more than 1,400 sandwiches and sold them. And she said, it was a lot of work, but I truly enjoyed it. I never knew before what possibilities there were in a business career. I just may be tempted to open a sandwich shop one day. So this was her one, but the one that got the award for originality, oh, this is the best yet. So the award for creativity was given to Mrs. Donald Cowley, and she was judged most unusual. She went into partnership with a boy on a farm near Salix, a farm owned by her father. And she supplied the young boy, paid for 2 pigs with her $1. And then she supplied the feed, and the boy supplied the labor of caring and fattening up the pigs. And then when they sold them, in time for her to report to the fundraising, her share was $30. I just love that story. It just shows the kind of creativity that went on. And, you know, I talked about those first 10 women needing structure and organization. I think it was the ones that came in the next 50 that had the creative energy. That's when the League started getting into a lot of those enrichment programs and the arts. And this kind of energy really took off in the League. By the end of the 1920s, they had that glee club. You saw the gals in their berets and their robes, and they were doing performances, whether it was for children or whether it was for larger groups or for fundraising. They also put on plays. They put on let's see, I believe it was called, yes, Mistress Mary Gives a Garden Party, and performed for 1,500 children on a Saturday morning in 1929. This is the only surviving photo we have of it, but all the League members who were performing dressed up as different characters from Mother Goose rhymes. And this is Little Bo Peep. So they were also into puppeteering and all types of enrichment things. They would end up 10 years later making by far the largest donation to apply to get that grant from the federal government to start the Art Center in Sioux City in the late 1930s. So you see, their drive for enrichment just seemed to know no bounds, and they did love performing, they did love fundraising, and they loved working in the community. One thing before I pass on to you, Becky, and talking about the community house, we've already mentioned that they were participating in the well baby clinics there. I think that this was where the Junior League first began to understand the importance of assessing needs and helping things to grow, and their first project of their very own, rather than just working at the day nursery or helping out with the Girl Scout troop that they had formed for the community gals that didn't have parents who could do that thing for them. They realized that there was a greater need for a well baby clinic, more so than just at the community house. You mentioned all those needy families living in the South Bottoms area, Theresa, and they realized that this well baby clinic needed to be on a larger scale. So in 1929, they established, along with the visiting nurses, 3 doctors, and it was held once a week now at City Hall in the visiting nurse's office. So it really, really grew. And they started directing specific funds just to that. I know I'm going way past my time, so I'm going to stop here. I'm immensely proud of what they started. They started a legacy that gave a lot of energy and a lot of confidence to the generations of us League members that would follow, that I see in our young actives today. And I'm very proud of them too. What they have done this past year, in spite of COVID, keeping things together, and this year to reach 100 years after the one they just went through, kudos to them. I think they got it. They're doing great.
That's excellent. Thank you, Karen. Great stories of the founding, and those stories are are really the heart of history when we can
Yeah.
learn those pieces. Absolutely. All right, Becky, tell us a little bit about Mary Traelia and the community house.
Yeah, hi. I just want to say that everyone's presentations have been amazing. I'm definitely not a historian. So bear with me, I guess. I did some research, and so hopefully if anybody knows, or if I'm saying something incorrectly, I apologize. I do want to start to also saying that historically we and continue to work with both the League of Women Voters and Junior League throughout all of the 100 years that we're celebrating. Mary Treglia Community House was founded in 1921 and I think Karen mentioned the settlement house model, and back in the 1800s, it was kind of when that settlement model kind of peaked in our history, and primarily peaked in the 20s here in America. And the goal was to bring the rich and the poor of society to kind of mingle together in both physical proximity and in social interactions and social interconnectedness. Usually those settlement houses were set in an industrial low-income areas, which Sioux City in those times was considered that. So why was it started in Sioux City? Like Theresa had mentioned, that we had a primary number, like 20%, I think you mentioned, Theresa, was folks that were from immigrant community, or from the immigrant community. So we was started in Sioux City because there were a couple things being noticed. The children were going to school and they weren't speaking English. And so it was hard to teach those students. Adults were working in mostly the packing plants, which Theresa, you mentioned, the big three, and they were unable to arise above their low income status that they were in. And we had 21 different cultures or nationalities living kind of in the same area, that South Bottom area. And they were each living in their own separate communities. No interaction. And one of the biggest things that some of the documentation that I've seen, and like the Junior League, we have all of our minutes out, like in our, we have all of the minutes in our notebooks and all of the little ledgers and all of those things. And so, but one of the biggest terms that was being said a lot was, then Americanization needed to occur. It wasn't happening. People weren't assimilating to our culture. And so community house or settlement house was established. It began, the discussion actually started with the YMCA. And so the community house, of course, was again made on that model, which involved that some personal contact. So there's stories of Mary Trelia's mom, Rose, that went out to neighbors and knocked on the doors. When there's some back and forth history there, but just being involved in that community and getting folks to come out and do different activities of all different ages within that organization. So in 1921, the YMCA established this community, and Mary Traelia, who obviously grew up in Sioux City, she left for quite a while, came back in 1921, and she actually attended that opening of that Mary Traelia, of the community house. So she began volunteering because she noticed that there was so much maladjustment, was the term that she had used. And then she was volunteering in that programming, and then just became one of the assistant to the community house director. And so Dorothy Anderson was actually the first director of the community house, and she was actually not the director. I'm sorry, she was the unfortunately they called them the secretary executive secretary. She ran the organization, but she was an executive secretary. So Mary was born in Sioux City, and her father died rather young. She was 22 months old when he passed away, and her mom raised her solely on her own by supporting them with a a little small store on the corner of a downtown area. And she did go to public school. And when she was in school, she recognized that she was pretty athletic. She threw the baseball better than most of the boys in her classroom or even in her school. So she became really good at playing baseball. And so when her mom got ill in 1919, they decided that they needed to go to California. And so she did move to California. She was there for a few years. And during that time, she joined the Bloomer Girls, which is a baseball team that was named after Amelia Bloomer, who was a suffrage. She, from 1890s to the 1934, the Bloomer Girls actually played in local towns. They were semi-pro, minor league men teams. So they played against men. And I'm sure they won. That's awesome. Many games. So they were young single women, were able to earn a living by playing baseball, probably a sport that they really, really loved in a time when that was probably very, it was hard for women to earn a living, and then to be able to do that playing baseball was probably something that was kind of, I'm sure, shocking. She also was, while in California, able to do some acting and was able to participate in some of those behind the scenes not behind the scenes, but like extras and stuff. So she was kind of a little movie star. Came back to Sioux City in 1921, as I mentioned, and her mom also came back with her. And then she became the assistant to the executive secretary, recognizing that when working in a community house or a settlement house, there was a need for education. And knowing that her role there was needed, that level of education, she did actually go back to college. And in 1933, she graduated with a social work degree. And during that time, then she became the director. And during the time that she was a director, she continued kind of those core programs that we continue to serve and do now. So that's kind of why I think Theresa asked when we were talking about this presentation, talk about what's different between now and then. And a ton hasn't really changed, unfortunately and fortunately. So during Mary Traelia's time, she continued the English language learning classes. She was working on bringing those immigrants together and Americanizing them, and preparing them to become citizens. So part of that citizen process is learning English and then learning civics and being able to go through that process of becoming a citizen. ELL, or English language learning, and citizenship classes are our core services, and have been, obviously, like I mentioned. They also had groups like Women of All Nation groups, which was actually a very substantial organization or group that met. Each time they met, it was, again, maybe the people weren't speaking the same language, but they were dealing with the same issues of raising children, husbands going to work, sure, and household types of things. And so those conversations were led, and I think they were talking about exchanging recipes. And like Theresa mentioned, the different cultures that were being noticed or being represented at the Mary Traelia house was the same cultures, obviously, that were being we're seeing throughout the city, and at that point in time, just like we talk about, and even in bigger cities where there's Chinatown or Little Italy or those different spots, we had that all in one concentrated area.
Right.
And there was a petition, or there was a campaign to change that kind of a derogatory term of that South Flats, that Mary Traelia felt that that was something that needed to be addressed, that we shouldn't be considering that a poor part of town, or a bad or negative connotation. In 1931, Mary Traelia began a campaign to help fight hard luck. And basically that was kind of how we advertised for jobs, like we need someone to work as such and such. Actually, it was Mary Traelia was taking the person's abilities and skills and actually advertising those out to the companies. And she was able to place about 782 people of the unemployed members of the community in positions. So it was kind of an interesting concept. I kind of like it. And I think there's been lots of things like that happening, even to this day. And then again, the well baby checks and immunizations, and the beauty of the community house in itself is the fact that it was taking the needs of the community and addressing those, and using multiple organizations like Junior League and League of Women Voters, and using the skills that are brought from those organizations into the community house. And throughout the years that has happened and continues to happen. The settlement houses aren't necessarily something that we see a lot of. We're very rare in Sioux City that we actually are still surviving, I guess is a word, as how you would describe that, and still being able to be associated as being a vital community organization. A lot of those community houses kind of went on those, or settlement houses kind of went on kind of went away. Yeah. And partly, I think that some of the theory is that settlement houses weren't able to move with the times and to adjust. And Mary Traelia Community House, along with obviously the people, not just Mary Traelia, but the Jane Yateses that were a part of that organization, the Dorothy Andersons, those women that were able to look at what's going on in our community, and not just in their neighborhoods, but in the community at large, and being able to say, I might not be able to do this particular thing, but we can invite Junior League in, or we can invite the health department in, or we can have visiting nurses come to look at these issues that are affecting the families that we work with, and can move and kind of be fluid with that. And that's how I think it was survived, how we've survived, and we continue to do that work today.
I think that's a great point to wrap up that segment with, which is the way these organizations changed over time. What did help them survive? Thank you for adding that. Let me ask you all three a question, if you can answer briefly. What do you see as the biggest impact your organization has had? What's one really lasting accomplishment that you want to point out? I think, Carolyn, should we go back to the League of Women Voters?
Well, I appreciate that. Certainly voter education with our candidate forums, with our state legislator forums, where the public has the opportunity to hear, ask, speak, write questions. I might note that in 1972, we became not for women only, that men also joined. And I think probably the time that got the most national attention was when the League of Women Voters hosted the 1976, 1980, and 1984 TV televised presidential debates And when we took the stand in 1988, that if they wouldn't follow by our rules of being fair and not run by the political parties, we turned down doing them anymore. And I think that's been a real loss for our country. But the League of Women Voters won an Emmy Award for that effort. So I think that really got the message out. And we continue to do lots of things, particularly with youth and the Mayor's Youth Commission, involving them in our school board candidates forum, naturalization ceremonies, which we were fortunate to have one at Mary Traelia in the last 10 years. So I'll turn it over to Becky and to, are you next?
Yeah.
I'm not sure who's next.
Karen, tell us a little bit it's hard to pick one, I know.
It really is. I mean, the League has had so many wonderful brick and mortar projects. I think about the $75,000 for the reading room at the library, the $55,000 that went to the nature center. Our recent remodeling of the Children's Hands-On Gallery was over $80,000. And since the museum's hosting this, I got to make sure I bring up that fact that the League purchased the Pierce Mansion and turned that over to so that the city could have a real home for the museum. But honestly, when I think of the greatest gift to the city, it's that the Junior League has provided so much training for young women. Because remember, this is a young women's organization, not my age. And it used to be up until 25 years ago, 30 years ago, you had to go sustaining and end your active career at age 40. So this is a young women's organization. And the fact that we have given training and confidence and a safe place to try out new things and leadership skills and supplied tens of thousands of trained volunteers for this city, to me, that's an accomplishment. And I think that is what the League should be recognized for, not the brick and mortar projects. I think that's what the real heart of our organization is.
Thank you. Thank you. That's wonderful. Becky, what do you think?
I would say, our mission statement obviously is to welcome people and newcomers into our community. And that is probably one of the things that our legacy is that is one of the what we do is provide a welcoming place, but also making sure that we celebrate the diversity that's in our community and providing that group of people a place to come when to celebrate their cultures, but then also when there's need and questions and assistance and things like that. So I think that will be our biggest legacy, is that we fight and advocate, I guess not fight isn't a good word to say, but we advocate for the diversity of our community and make sure that we are representing them and putting someone in place where they have that's safe and be able to answer questions and welcome them.
Yeah, excellent. It's as we talk, it's interesting to see the ties really of training, of education, and to recognize that well, it makes sense. Those were the things that women in particular have been interested in. One aspect that we haven't talked about yet is diversity. And if you were watching when we had the slides up of these founders, they were generally white, upper middle class women. And those were the women who were primarily involved in the progressive movement that we hear about. There were a lot of other women doing work, and their work is even more lost in terms of history. I mean, women get lost in history. If you're a woman of color, you're probably even more lost in history. And we're now doing better about recognizing that and trying to recognize those women over time that have done work. But, our organizations, these organizations were essentially segregated, not by law, but by custom. How has your organization's how have they changed? How do they address diversity today? Anybody want to jump in there first? We don't have to go in our particular order.
Well, I'll go first anyways. I think it's significant that the League of Women Voters in the last few years has really owned the reality that Carrie Chapman Kat, even as an Iowan, was not exposed to different people. She actually made money after her first husband died on the speaking circuit, and she was anti-immigrant. I think life changed her. Fortunately, Eleanor Roosevelt was one of our first National League board members, and I think she had a powerful influence on the League. And I have to admit that Carrie Chapman Kat, I've always thought of her in many ways as a practical politician. You had to win the South in order to get the 19th Amendment to give women the right to vote. And that meant white men having to be convinced, which that's some excuse, but it's still not all right. I don't think she was a bigot. There have been a nice article by Louise Noon in the Des Moines Register that really spoke to, was she or wasn't she, in the sense that no, she was not. For what we are doing now, and I'll get a plug in for a program, we really, as a national, state, and local leagues, are working on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and trying to really make ourselves look at that. We're blessed that we have some wonderful folks who are, the term today, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. But on June 27th, not but, in our focus on looking at the issues, we will be hosting we hope it'll be live. We've already had to cancel once. We hope we have it take place June 27th, 2 to 3 p.m. at the Betty Strong Encounter Center. We're going to celebrate hard won, the winning of the 19th Amendment, but that we're not done. And the reality of voting was that in 1920, many African-American women could not vote because of the various strictures that were put in place by states. Native American women did not get the vote till, I believe, 1925. Asians later than that, and really the 1965 Voting Rights Act finally brought a sense of African Americans being able to get out and be comfortable in voting, though there are issues with that today. But our program will be a panel discussion with 4 women of the BIPOC community: Flora Lee, Karen Mackey, Tricia Ettringer, a Native American female. Flora is kind of known by most people, African American. Karen is head of our Human Rights Commission, and also Siouxland Pride. And also Stacy Alex, who is a professor at Morningside College of Multicultural Affairs and is Latinx. So they will be talking about the reality of their experience with the vote and what their suggestions are for change and for involvement. And particularly the League of Women Voters is very upset by the voter suppression action that's taken place at the state level, and we will be addressing that as time goes along. But we have to work at it.
Very good. Karen or Becky, do you have a comment on this topic?
Yeah, I will say that the Junior League, not just Junior League of Sioux City, but junior leagues internationally, we don't look like we did in our early years, which was a predominantly upper class, middle to upper class, white women's society. We are so diverse. And I mentioned early in my presentation how few of them were working outside the home at that time. I'd be surprised if across the association, we aren't at 95% of the women working outside the home. And every race, nationality, color, languages. We're in 4 countries. It may not be my mother's or my grandmother's junior league anymore, but that doesn't mean we don't still think the same way. It's still about bettering our communities. And what we look like doing that doesn't seem to make as much difference as it used to 100 years ago. It's all about having an interest in and a commitment to volunteerism. And that's what's essential.
Yeah, thank you. Becky?
I would just say that, well, I mean, at Mary Traelia, we need to mirror the communities that we serve. So we definitely do that. And I think that's the biggest piece of what a community house is going to do. It's going to actually just mirror what is happening in our communities. So I kind of see us as a kind of not necessarily, we're not a pass through, but we're just, we like our mission statement, we educate, we advocate. And so that also means then we make sure that not only are we mirroring what our community looks like, but then we also are advocating for that. And I think that's always been happening since 1920. And again, just like you mentioned, Karen, like, and Carolyn, that you look back and it might not, the terms and some of the things that were written in our documents are a little shocking, and you're like, and those types of things. But in truth, the work that was being done at Mary Treglia Community House was really to just be a community center for people to come and to become a community. And that's kind of what we need to continue to do.
Excellent. I don't see any questions from our audience. I do see an audience member who's got a very good idea, and that is to encourage groups to join forces and put forth names of women to fill the Woodbury County treasurer vacancy. I'm not going to touch that one tonight, but I will say that clearly all these three organizations were involved in putting women forward as leaders. I love the way the stories have converged in terms of training and just helping women be leaders in the community, and just the incredible impact that these groups have had, the impact of the individual people, but the impact of the group as well. 100 years of just amazing work from these
And
women.
you know what, Theresa, something yesterday you were talking about the fact that again, it was that social class and how they were interested in, one thing we never talked about is why did they, and why here? Why did they get so involved here in this community? Because there's certainly other cities where they didn't. And I know, just for instance, let's face it, our community often compares itself to Sioux Falls, like we're the poor stepsister that, our little brother grew taller and faster and got richer. But you know what? They didn't volunteer like we did, and they didn't dive in early on like we did. Their junior league was 4 decades forming after the Junior League of Sioux City. We were the first one in the state of Iowa, way ahead of even big cities like Dallas and Los Angeles. Why was there so much interest in giving back here? And I think that's a point of pride worth exploring further.
Yeah. Probably have to read through some of those ledgers and minutes and notes to kind of pick up the thread.
Yeah.
But I think the personal stories that you've shared make it, they speak to that as well. So yeah, there's a lot more history out there though, definitely.
Oh yeah.
Well, ladies, I think we're gonna, I think we'll wrap it up tonight. And I want to thank all of our guests for joining us and listening. And I want to thank our speakers. So yeah, thanks to you guys very much. I love your,
you.
you
Yeah,
bet.
thank
You
you.
bet.
Thank you.
The passion is tremendous. So it's going to be, who knows, maybe somebody will be back sitting in these seats 100 years from now. I would guess they will be. It's amazing. So, all right. I'm
much.
going to end this tonight. Thanks again, everybody. Bye-bye.